Hello everyone, welcome back to the One Code Camp channel. Today we're going to discuss how to create a random code generator. Now, a random code generator is one of the best beginner ideas in order to get your web development journey started. And this will help you get to know the basics of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is open our Visual Studio Code application. Now, if you don't have this, that's fine. Just go to the official website and get the Visual Studio Code applicable for your operating system. Now, once you have it open, go to File, Open Folder, and navigate to the folder you want to open for this project. In my case, I named it Random Code Generator. And if you don't have a folder yet, just right-click, New, and create a folder. Now, once you have the folder selected, click on it and select Folder, and you'll be redirected to this window. Next thing we'll do is go to Extensions, and make sure that we have Live Server installed. Now, Live Server makes it so that every time we make changes on the HTML, it will auto-refresh the page. Now, once it's installed, let's go back to our Explorer tab, and create our first file. Now, the first file we're going to create for this page is the HTML file. Now, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it determines the structure of our page. So let's right-click, New File, and let's name this file index.html, and it will store how this page will be structured. So let's type in HTML:5. This is an example of an Emmet abbreviation, and this types out the boilerplate code so we won't have to do it ourselves. And the next thing we're going to edit is the title. Let's name it Random Code Generator. And let's add in a link to our CSS that we'll make later. And that should be it for our head. So let's move on to the body. Let's create a div with the class container. And inside this div, we're going to have an h2 that has the text of generate a random code. And then we'll need a container for our code. So let's use block code. And let's give it an ID of code. So let's just put some placeholder text in here, call it loading. And then we're going to create a span with an ID of author. This will hold whoever made the code, but for now, we'll make it a placeholder of loading. Now let's create a container for the button. Create a normal div, and inside this div, we're going to have a button with an ID of new code. Inside this button, we're going to put in the text new code, and this button will generate a new code every time we click it. And the last thing we need is a script tag. Now we're going to add a source. And this is just going to be a link to a JavaScript external file that will manipulate the behavior of our HTML later on. We're going to call the file script.js, and let's give it a type of text/JavaScript. And that's it for HTML. Click and open with Live Server to check out what we have so far. So it doesn't really look like much now, but it does hold our basic structure of the page, but we gotta make it look pretty. So let's create our CSS file, right-click, New File, and let's call it style.css. Now, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it determines how our page is going to look like. So let's go to Google Fonts, link in the description, and get a specific font that we want to use for this project. Now, I already have mine, so I'm just going to select the import and paste it into my CSS file by copying and pasting and taking out the unnecessary tags. And now we have our own font family for this project. So the next thing I'm going to do is select everything. So I'm going to use the font family for the whole project. So let's use asterisk, which means all, curly braces, and I'm going to reset the margin and the padding of the whole document. I'm going to add a box sizing of border box. And I'm going to set the font family to what we just imported. It's called Libre Baskerville. And it's a serif font. So that's it for the all selector. And the changes have pushed through. So the next thing I'm going to do is target the body using the body selector. And I'm going to set the background image to something straight from the Unsplash API. Now this link, https source.unsplash.com/random/1920x1080 is going to return a random image of 1080p quality straight from the Unsplash collection. So we can save this. And shortly, a new image is going to appear. There you go. Now our image is random every time we refresh. So I'm going to make sure that it won't repeat by using background repeat, no repeat. We're going to set the background size to auto. That's it for the body selector. Now let's move on to the container class. We're going to set the background color to a black with a bit of opacity. We're going to give it a width of 700 pixels, a position of absolute, a top of 50%, a left of 50%, and a transform translate of both negative 50%. This just makes it so that the div is going to be centered. And it should look like that. We're going to give it a bit of padding, 40 pixels, a border radius of 10 pixels, extra line of center, a box shadow of 0, 10px, 20px, 0px, and let's make it a black shadow with a bit of opacity. And we're going to set the text color to white. Now let's save. And it should look something like this, with the text color being white and everything being centered. It looks like we're ready to go to the next selector. Now we're going to select the H2 inside of the container. Now we're going to give it a font size of 32 pixels, a margin bottom of 40 pixels, and a position of relative. And it should look something like this. Next, we're going to target the after of the H2. So we're going to say H2 : after. And this will have a content of nothing, but its width will be 75 pixels. Its height will be 3 pixels. We're going to give it a border radius of 3 pixels. And we're going to give it a background of this blue color. Then we're going to give it a position of absolute, a bottom of negative 10 pixels, and a left of 50%, and a transform translate. Gonna make it X this time and give it a negative 50%. Now it should look something like this. So we just generated a blue line right after our H2. So the next thing we're going to do is target the container again, but this time we're going to target the block code. Now for this block code, we're going to use a font size of 26 pixels. And then we're going to give it a minimum height of 110 pixels. And that should be what it looks like. So the next thing we're going to target is the before and after of the block code. So we could put quotes before and after the code that we're going to generate. So let's say block code before and block code after. Just copy that. There you go. Make it after. And inside here, we're going to make the content a single quote. And now we're going to see a quote before and after our block code. The next thing we're going to target is the container span. Now the span is going to hold the author of the code, so we're going to make the display block. Give it a margin top of 10 pixels. Make it float to the right, so it's going to be on the right. And give it a position of relative. And the next thing we're going to target is before the span. So we could give it a little stylized dash. So we could say span before, and the content is going to be nothing again. But its width is going to be 10 pixels. Its height is going to be 2 pixels. And give it a background of the same blue we used previously. Then we're going to give it a position of absolute. Give it a top of 50%. Give it a left of negative 20 pixels. And that should be what it looks like. It's going to be a dash right before the author. So the next thing we're going to target is the div that contains the button of new code. So you could say container div. Give it a width of 100%. A margin top of 50 pixels. A display of flex. Justify content of center, so it will be in the middle. And this should be what it looks like. So now the new code is in the middle. The only thing left to style is the button. So let's target this button. Give it a background of the same blue that we used a while ago. Make the color white. give it a border radius of 25 pixels. Give it a border of 1 pixel, make it solid, and the same blue that we used last time. And the width is going to be 150 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a display of flex. So we could use align item center and justify content center, so everything's in the middle. And we could give it a margin of 5 pixels to give it a little space. And it's going to be a pointer every time we hover over the button. So that's what it should look like. Now that everything is styled, it looks like we could move on to our JavaScript. So the JavaScript is responsible for behavioral changes inside of our page. So if you want to change something or tweak how something looks, then we could rely on the JavaScript in order to do this. So once again, we create a new file and we'll name it script.js. So the first thing we need to do is put the API URL inside a variable that can't be changed. So let's make a constant variable, make it API_URL, and it's going to be the API where we're going to get our codes. This will also be linked in the description. So let's try and open this in a new window and see what it looks like. So this is what it should look like. What we need to focus on is the content. If you don't know where you're going, you will probably end up somewhere else. And the author. So this is what we want to show inside our website. And in order to do that, let's go back to the code. And in order to actually mess with the elements, we first need to be able to select them. So let's make another const, make it the code, and this is going to select the specific element that pertains to the code inside of the HTML document. So we're going to start with document, and this just determines that it will be inside the HTML, and we're going to use query selector. Now inside the parentheses, we're going to use # code, and it will determine an element that has an ID of code, because the # would refer to an ID. And we're going to do the same thing for the author, make it const author. And once again, document.querySelector, and it's a # again, but this time it will be author. So to look for an element with the ID of author. Then we're going to create a link to the button. So once again, document.querySelector, and we made the ID new code. Now we're done with creating the links to our HTML elements. Now being able to select these HTML elements is the start of what's called as DOM manipulation. So DOM would stand for the document object model, and this just refers to being able to change the behavior of specific elements, whether it be running a function every time you click something, or changing the look of a certain element depending on a certain event. And now we want the code from the API to display on the page, so let's add a function for that. So let's start with async function, and we'll name it getCode. This will have no parameters, and we could start it off with an empty curly braces. So the reason why we start with async is because this function is going to take a while to process the API URL, and it's basically telling the program that it's okay to do other processes before I'm done. So in here, we're going to create another const variable, make it response, and we're going to await the response that we fetch from the API URL. And this is going to be constant because the response won't change inside of the function anyway, so we could just leave it as constant. And we use the await keyword to signify that this will run asynchronously, and we use the fetch keyword in order to send out a request to the API in order to get our code. Now the next thing we're going to do is find a way to parse the response. And in order to do that, let's create a new data variable. Now this data variable also uses the await keyword, and using the response, it will take all of its contents and put it into a JSON. Now a good example of a JSON is what we saw after we opened the API URL. That was an example of the JSON and its contents. The next thing we're going to do is edit the contents of the code. So we're going to replace the contents of the code with the content inside of the data. This would refer to the code that's inside of there. And the next thing we're going to do is duplicate this and replace code with author instead, and make it the data.author. Alright, so after we save it, notice that nothing is happening yet currently. And that's because we haven't run the function yet. So in order to see this, let's try running the function by invoking it over here at the end. Then let's save. And there you go. You can't win unless you learn how to lose. By Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So that's an example of how the code is going to run inside of our generator. But our button doesn't work yet. So let's try adding an event where the button will use the function getCode. So we say button, add event listener, and we're going to use the click event because every click, a function should run. And inside here, we want the function getQuote to run every time we click. So we save that. And every time we click new quote, a new quote now generates. So now our random quote generator is finally finished, and we can now generate random quotes every time. So that's about it for the random quote generator. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.